So I got divorced after being married for 20 years. And I think my wife and I both knew that we had married the wrong person after the first year. We just didn't want to make any rash decisions. So I find myself in this therapist office, and we'd been there for a couple of meetings trying to split up with Harmony. And that's a pipe dream, by the way. And the therapist takes one look at me and she says, listen, you know what your problem is? You feel you're unworthy of love. And so you married someone who didn't love you. And I was like, well, that probably wasn't a good idea. But I also knew she was exactly right. And I started thinking, when was it in my life that I adopted that belief, that I was unworthy of love? And after a while, I came across this thought that I remembered that I was trying to forget. And I was about 7 years old, and I was with my mom and some friends, some of her friends, some of my friends, and at a diner. And I was clowning around like I always did. I was really talkative. I was too talkative as a kid. And I was joking around trying to make people laugh, because that's one of the things that gave me joy in life, is making people laugh. And I look over and I see my mom, and it looks like she's disappointed. And it's kind of hard for me to discern sometimes, because that's her usual look. And we get home that night, turns out she was disappointed. So she calls me into the kitchen and we sit down, and she says, Tim, do you know what the Chinese water torture is? And I was like, no, I don't. And look, let me clarify. This was actually invented by an Italian in the 16th century, but then blamed on the Chinese. So that's kind of a pattern that's followed. But so she says to me, she says, look, what they would do is they would strap down, a prisoner, and then they would just drip water on the forehead. And it just kept coming, and it never stopped. And, after hours and a couple of days of this, the person would actually lose their mind. And Mom said, when you're clowning around and making all that racket, that's what I feel you're doing to me. And I had no idea at the time how that would silence me and keep me from trying to be funny for most of my life. Now, if somebody tries to keep you from being funny, it's not that big of a deal unless you are called to be a comedian. Then it becomes a problem. So this is something I've been struggling with for a while. So I finally, when I'm about 30, I feel like I'm called, this is what I'm supposed to do in my life, to be a comedian. So I end up at a improv theater in New York City called the Upright Citizens Brigade. And so I show up there, and I'm probably, like I said, about 30. Everybody there is maybe 10 years younger than me. They're all actors. They're all beautiful. They're all, really good at acting, and they've taken all these classes. And so, of course, I'm thinking, what am I doing here? And I remember we were playing this game where you take a suggestion from the audience, and it was love, and then you have to go around the circle. We're all up on the stage. You go around the circle and you sing a song that you're inspired by love, And so I am actually, as it's getting closer to me to sing, I'm actually looking down at my backpack there in the front row, and I'm thinking, what's going to be less humiliating? Picking up my backpack and walking out of here, or standing here and singing. And as I'm trying to do that cost-benefit analysis in my head, it's my turn to sing. And I end up belting out, I think it was Copacabana by Barry Manilow. A classic, yeah. So I end up staying. I stayed. And that's so unlike me. Usually I just run from these things, but I stayed, and I'm glad I did. I'm glad I pushed through that fear, because my instructor was a woman named Amy Poehler. And 2 years later, she got on SNL, and I got to go with her and do some work for her while she was at SNL. Now, I was this close to walking out of that opportunity. And that was a good lesson for me. Now, I learned in improv, one of the things Amy taught me, and I say that only really to name drop, but but also to give credit where credit's due, okay? So she taught me, there's this principle in improv that was written by a guy named Del Close, who's the founder of long-form improv. And the principle is follow the fear. And the idea is when you're on stage and you have all these ideas come to your mind as a response to your partner or to the scene, there's one of those ideas will scare the heck out of you. And Del Close says you have an obligation to run toward that idea. 100%, all in, fully committed. And the reason is, the idea scares you because it's a new frontier that you haven't explored yet, okay? And because it's new, it'll yield like the most beautiful scene, the greatest creative idea that you could come up with in that moment. So it's very counterintuitive. It takes a while to get used to, and I'm still working on getting used to it. But I'm starting to see the benefits of adopting this as a way of life. Now, I tried comedy for a while. I did stand-up. I wrote for the late shows. I just tried a bunch of things to try to make some money and proved to my wife that I could sustain a living here. And then my daughter Katie was born. Okay, and this was a bit of a surprise, which is weird because she's adopted. So I don't... We probably should have seen that coming. I'll give you that. But my wife's like, listen, you got to go get a job with dental benefits. So I was interviewing and a friend told me about this job at IBM and it was a speechwriter. And I was like, you know what? That would be a fun job. Now, there are only two problems. One, I've never written a speech, okay? And two, I have like this 2-year hole in my resume that just says like the Giggle Shack in Nyack. But I go in there, and as it turns out, they offer me the job. As I'm trying to speak and pitch myself, I get interrupted, and the executives just keep on talking. And so I cannot lose the job if I try it. So I had 3 job offers. Okay, 2 jobs were in business development and sales, which I've done all my life, and I could do in my sleep, and I could make a ton of money. This job would be a pay cut. If I went to work at IBM as a speechwriter, it would be a pay cut, and I was unqualified. Other than that, it seemed like a good fit. But there was something in me, there was a joy about this job, and I thought, all right, I'm gonna follow the fear here. And I did. So I take that job, I get on there, and I figure my comedy career's over. But the second day I'm there, an executive says, hey, I hear you have a comedy background, can you write a joke for me in a speech I'm giving? And then a couple of months later, I'm thinking about creative ways to get our messaging out. And I said, let's do a comedy video on YouTube. And everybody was like, no, everybody shot it down. 7 executives said no. And so I was just quiet. I didn't want to lose my job. But I pitched the idea again for some stupid reason. And they said, okay, let's give it a shot. And of course, through that process, every video that got press exposure, press coverage, or won an award that we created that was a comedy, every one of those, I knew I was going to be fired for. And I mean, it wasn't like I feel a little uncomfortable about this. I'm going to get fired for this. And thank goodness I had a friend, Scott Teams, who helped me out on these things, and he pushed me through. But it was such a wonderful reminder that you got to keep pushing through those things that scare you the most. So one of the things that helped get me the job there is these people said, wait, you played Senator Beacons, right? And I was like, yeah. And so that helped me get the job. Now, the Senator Beacons things is a whole other story. This came from a TV commercial. And listen, I'll tell you this, if you ever feel like you're getting away from humility and you're becoming a little too arrogant, go audition for a TV commercial. All right, this is one of the most humbling experiences I think you can go through. It's just you and a casting director who does not want to be there. And they give you these slides, the script to read that you just get. And I was never good at reading other people's words. What worked for me is just improvising. And like if somebody says something, coming up with something funny to say, a quick funny reply. But there was no place for that in auditioning for a commercial. So I go in for this audition. I get called back on this audition, and I come in here to this to a casting room, and there are 2 benches on each side, and so you're right up next to another actor. And these actors are all talking. I mean, it's designed really to ruin your self-esteem. You're just right up there with people who've been doing this forever. And I walk in there, and all of these people are talking about the roles they're in, the plays they're in, the films they booked, the other commercials that they booked, the acting classes they're taking. And I'll never forget these words that came to mind. You have no business being here. It wasn't audible, but I knew, and I'm glad it wasn't, but I knew I was in the wrong place. And I found myself looking down again at my backpack and deciding to leave. And right when I just remembered, right when I was getting ready to leave, I remembered a sermon I heard at church. At church at this time, I hadn't pulled away from church. That happened in my life too. But I was at church and I heard this sermon about this guy named Gideon in the Old Testament. And basically Gideon, he's called to go fight 135,000 warriors with his 300 warriors. And he wins. Now, I'm leaving a few pieces out just for brevity, but he wins. You can look it up in the book of Judges. But Gideon's a coward. He admits he's a coward. And when he gets called to do this, he responds, look, I'm the weakest of my clan, and my clan's the weakest of anybody here in the tribe. And he's sitting here arguing about how he got the wrong guy, and I'm totally unqualified for it. And the punchline of the sermon was that God doesn't call the qualified, he qualifies the called. And when I remembered that, I thought, okay. And I just said a little prayer to myself. I said, all right, listen, I'm going to go in there this one last time. I'll stay here and I'll go humiliate myself. But I was like negotiating with God, like you have any leverage in that situation. But if this doesn't work out, I'm going to go do something else. So and at that moment, I had been at the end of my life. It was the most desperate place I've been in my life. And I just feel like I had failed so many times and just was making mistakes and making bad choices. And I was just like, okay, I was at peace. I was like, I'm going to release this now and we'll see what happens. And so I'm sitting there waiting for them to call Tim because it's my turn to go into the audition room. And I said, all right, God, this is in your hands. And the casting director calls my name. Hey, Ted. And I could not believe it. I really felt abandoned by God in that moment. I was like, do you really, and I said this, I said, do you really, I said, do you really have to get my name wrong? I mean, that's what smiting is, I guess, right? And so I didn't say anything. I was so horrified and humiliated. I'm just going to sit here and be quiet, and they'll pass up on me. And then a few minutes later, he says, Ted Washer. And I'm like, okay, now I have to go. So I'm walking into this audition room, and the film director's there, the people from the ad agency are there, the people from the client are there. And the film director sees what's going on. And he can see that I felt embarrassed by this. So he tries to make light of it, and he says, and I walk in, and he says, I said, well, my name is actually Tim. And the director says, well, maybe we call you Ted. And then the next thing that came out of my mouth was, I prefer Theodore. So the director starts laughing, the people from the agency start laughing, the people from the client are like, they're cracking up, laughing. And as I'm walking in there, I'm not even in the room yet, and I realize what happened. The circumstances had changed to my advantage. What I thought I couldn't do, I knew I couldn't have any way to show my strengths there, but the circumstances changed so that I could. It was an alley-oop. And I just was like, okay, thank you. And I stepped in, and it was a cakewalk. I mean, I couldn't do anything wrong. I was just improvising and doing this, and I ended up booking the commercial. And this was the filibuster commercial that I booked. And it's the one that IBM people saw And it's the reason they gave me the job, because they saw me in this filibuster commercial. So it led to other things. All these other TV shows, I got Conan O'Brien and things like that, because they saw this commercial. It ended up being a really good commercial, and it won awards. And that led to another commercial with Catherine Zeta-Jones, a T-Mobile commercial. That wasn't a bad gig. I mean, if you have to pick a colleague, she's going to be in your top 5 probably. And it was such a blessing to just say, look, if I just take the next step, especially if I'm afraid, especially if I feel unqualified, something's going to happen. And I hope that all of you continue to do that more if you're doing that. And I hope that you look for a time next week when you feel maybe unqualified, or maybe not good enough, and just say, I'm going to follow the fear. Thank you so much.